The first surprise for people from the UK arriving in Canada is how familiar everything appears before it begins to feel quietly unfamiliar. The streets follow patterns that echo British order mixed with North American scale. The language sounds the same, the institutions look recognizable, and the social rules seem, at first glance, politely aligned. Yet beneath that surface comfort, a subtle dissonance emerges. Canada feels less compressed, less tightly wound, as though daily life has been given more room to breathe. Early impressions often center on space and calm. Cities move with intention rather than urgency. Public interactions feel measured, softer at the edges. In cafes, shops, and public transport, voices rarely rise. People wait without visible frustration, and apologies flow easily, sometimes even when no fault exists. For those from the UK, accustomed to restraint paired with quiet social tension, this gentleness can feel unusual. The politeness resembles home, but it lacks the underlying sharpness. It feels less performative and more instinctive. One of the most noticeable differences lies in emotional atmosphere. In the UK, politeness often coexists with irony, guardedness, or dry detachment. In Canada, courtesy tends to be warmer, less defensive. Conversations with strangers carry a tone of ease, free from the subtle skepticism that often accompanies British small talk. Smiles linger longer. Neutral interactions feel genuinely neutral, rather than socially strategic. This creates an environment that feels safe, but also slightly disorienting. The pace of daily life reinforces this impression. Canadians appear unhurried in ways that contrast with the quiet efficiency prized in the UK. Lines move steadily, but without pressure. People allow space, physically and emotionally, for others to exist without interruption. Silence is not awkward here, it is respected. This can feel both calming and unsettling for newcomers accustomed to reading between the lines of social restraint. Weather, too, plays a role in shaping these first impressions. Canadian winters are harsher than those of the UK, but they are met with collective preparation rather than complaint. The cold becomes a shared experience that softens social boundaries. Neighbors help without being asked. Strangers exchange small gestures of cooperation that feel routine rather than remarkable. Where British weather often becomes a shared grievance, Canadian weather becomes a shared responsibility. Slowly, these early observations begin to hint at something deeper. The difference is not dramatic or loud. It does not announce itself. Instead, it accumulates through small moments: how people wait, how they speak, how they acknowledge one another. For people from the UK, Canada does not feel foreign in the traditional sense. It feels like a familiar world that has been quietly adjusted, tuned to a slightly different emotional frequency. And it is within that subtle shift that the real culture shock begins to take shape. As time passes, these surface impressions begin to form a clearer pattern. What initially feels like simple politeness reveals itself as a deeply embedded cultural value. In Canada, social harmony is not maintained through restraint or irony, but through consistency. Courtesy is expected regardless of mood, status, or context. People apologize not to deflect blame, but to smooth the emotional terrain of everyday life. For those from the UK, where politeness often masks distance, this openness can feel unusually sincere. Public life reflects this mindset. In shared spaces, there is a noticeable absence of confrontation. Disagreements are softened, frustrations are muted, and escalation feels socially unacceptable. Where British culture often relies on understatement to signal boundaries, Canadian culture relies on calmness to prevent them from being crossed at all. This creates environments that feel emotionally safer, but also less layered. Interactions are clearer, less coded, and for some, less familiar. Another quiet contrast emerges in how community functions. In the UK, community often exists within defined circles, neighborhoods, workplaces, long-standing social groups. In Canada, community feels more fluid. It forms easily around circumstance rather than history. Temporary proximity can produce genuine cooperation. Neighbors help one another without formality, and small acts of assistance are offered without expectation of future obligation. This ease of connection can feel refreshing, but it can also challenge British instincts shaped by privacy and social caution. Work culture reinforces these differences further. While both societies value professionalism, Canada places less emphasis on endurance as a marker of worth. Long hours are not worn as evidence of dedication. Time off is treated as necessary rather than indulgent. For people from the UK, familiar with quiet overwork and unspoken pressure, this balance can feel almost permissive. Productivity exists, but it is not allowed to dominate personal identity. Even conversations around success carry a different tone. In Canada, modesty is not simply politeness, it is a social norm. Achievements are acknowledged gently, often downplayed. Ambition is acceptable, but self-promotion is discouraged. This mirrors British understatement on the surface, yet differs in intention. Where British modesty can be defensive or ironic, Canadian modesty feels collective, designed to keep social equilibrium intact. Over time, these patterns begin to influence emotional behavior. People from the UK often notice a gradual softening. The need to read subtext fades. Social interactions become less draining, less performative. There is less pressure to manage impressions carefully. Instead, there is space to exist without constant self-editing. This can feel liberating, but also subtly unsettling, as long-held social instincts lose their relevance. The culture shock deepens not because Canada feels alien, but because it feels gently disarming. It removes friction that many did not realize they had learned to live with. What remains is a quieter social world, one built not on distance or wit, but on mutual ease. And as this realization settles in, it becomes clear that the difference is not about nationality or habit alone. It is about how a society chooses to carry emotional weight, and how differently that weight is distributed. With longer exposure, the emotional effects of this environment become harder to ignore. People from the UK often describe a gradual internal shift that happens without intention. The constant background vigilance, monitoring tone, timing, and social positioning, begins to loosen. Interactions no longer feel like quiet negotiations. The social air is lighter. There is less need to brace for misunderstanding, less expectation of friction beneath politeness. This change is especially noticeable in moments of minor inconvenience. In the UK, disruption is often met with contained irritation, expressed through silence, sarcasm, or resigned endurance. In Canada, the same moments are absorbed collectively. Delays, mistakes, and small failures are met with patience rather than tension. The emotional burden of maintaining order does not fall on individuals alone, it is distributed across the group. This creates a sense of shared responsibility that subtly alters how people move through their days. Safety also contributes to this transformation, not only in physical terms but emotional ones. Public spaces feel less charged. There is less urgency in posture, less defensiveness in expression. People occupy space without apology or suspicion. For those from the UK, accustomed to quiet alertness and social reserve, this ease can feel unfamiliar. Over time, however, it becomes comforting. The body relaxes. The mind slows. A sense of permission emerges, permission to exist without constant self-monitoring. Yet this calm is not without its complexities. Some from the UK find the absence of edge disorienting. British culture often relies on humor sharpened by tension, on irony shaped by constraint. In Canada, where interactions are more emotionally level, that sharpness has less room to operate. Wit softens. Conversations become warmer but less guarded. What is gained in ease may feel, at times, like a loss of depth or complexity. The culture shock, then, is not purely positive or negative. It is an adjustment of emotional temperature. Over months and years, many begin to recognize what Canada quietly offers. Not perfection, but relief. A social environment that does not demand constant calibration. A culture where politeness is not armor, and calm is not mistaken for indifference. The difference lies not in grand gestures or national identity, but in thousands of small interactions that shape how people feel within a society. For people from the UK, Canada becomes a mirror that reflects familiar values, courtesy, restraint, cooperation, but rearranged in a way that feels unexpectedly gentle. It reveals how culture is not only what people say or do, but how much tension they carry while doing it. And in that realization, the deepest culture shock emerges, the understanding that life can feel familiar, functional, and yet emotionally lighter than one ever assumed possible.